співпраці із фондом Конрада Аденауера за підтримки Євангелічної церкви Німеччини та участі Екуменічного інституту католицького університету в Парижі запрошують до участі у міжнародному суспільному форумі.
З 3 по 7 жовтня 15-й екуменічний соціальний тиждень «Мандрівна ідентичність. Осмислення сенсів та цінностей».
Війна в Україні ставить перед нами важливі питання. Хто ми? Куди ми йдемо? У що ми віримо? Якою мовою ми спілкуємося? Яка наша культурна, національна, релігійна, політична ідентичність?
Під час 15-го екуменічного соціального тижня за участі науковців, експертів, журналістів, духовенства ми обговоримо різноманітні аспекти ідентичності людини, нації, громади, особливості її становлення та переосмислення. Реєстрація та деталі на сайті esweek.org.ua. Форум відбувається у гібридному форматі.
Слава Ісусу Христу! Доброго дня! Мене звати отець Роман Фігас, і від імені Інституту екуменічних студій запрошую вас на відкриту онлайн-дискусію під назвою «Ідентичність, ідеологія і сімейні цінності». Цю онлайн-дискусію ми проводимо в межах 15-го екуменічного соціального тижня, який організовує наш інститут екуменічних студій.
Organized by the Institute of Ecumenical Studies in tight cooperation with a great partner, Konrad Adenauer Foundation, and also with the support of the Evangelical Church in Germany. This ecumenical forum is number 15, a kind of jubilee one. And this year, it is concentrated on the wandering identity, reassessing values and senses. Our today's discussion will take place in 3 languages, Ukrainian, English, and German. That's why at the bottom of your pages in the language menu, you can press the button interpretation and select the language that is most convenient for you to listen to and to participate in this discussion.
Listening in English, some technical support is our online discussion will be held in 3 languages, in Ukrainian, in English, and in German. And for those who want to listen to in English or German, please select an interpretation button and choose the preferred language. So, зараз я передаю слово Halyna.
Now I am passing the floor to Halyna Teslyuk, who is Doctor of Biblical Theology. He is professor of the Ukrainian Catholic University, affiliated to the Department of Biblical Studies. So the floor is yours, and you are going to moderate this session. Thank you, Roman. Glory to Jesus Christ.
Session on identity, ideology, and family values. I am extremely honored to moderate this session and to be among these distinct professors and scholars in the subject. And let me tell you just briefly how it will work. We have presentations that probably will last more or less 15 minutes each. And afterwards, I'll open the floor to the questions. So our first speaker is Dr. Rebeka Anić, Franciscan nun that works at the Institute of Social Sciences, Pilar, Regional Center in Split, Croatia. And Dr. Anić will present her work in German, so you can switch the channel for the translation. And the topic of Dr. Anić is Gender oder Gender-Ideologie zu interkatholischen Diskursen. So the floor is yours, Dr. Anić.
Thank you. Aber meine Präsentation wird ein bisschen länger dauern, so wurde das schon bekannt. Okay, Ich begrüße alle ganz herzlich und danke den Organisatoren der Konferenz für die Einladung zu diesem Vortrag. Über das komplexe Thema Gender und
Я
Gender-Ideologie.
дякую за запрошення взяти участь у цьому екуменічному тижні. І моя тема звучить саме як питання гендеру впливає на українські церкви та пошук ідентичності.
Politik des Gender Mainstreaming verstanden wird. Dann stelle ich unterschiedliche Verständnisweisen innerhalb der katholischen Kirche vor und abschließend werde ich versuchen, die Frage zu beantworten, warum in Stellungnahme aus der katholischen Kirche Gender und Gender Mainstreaming abgelehnt wird. Zum Diskussionsthema wurde der Begriff Gender besonders während der Vorbereitungsarbeiten zur 4. Weltfrauenkonferenz in Peking 1995.
During the preparation for this conference in 1995 in Peking, we started working on this issue. There was a delegation from the Holy See and certain representatives of Islamic countries, and the commission that organized this conference. There was a special
Recording in
working group
progress.
created, and it was the whole event was dedicated to the issues of gender. There was nothing that would indicate another connotation of gender. And the question, the word gender was used maybe 200 times at this platform. But at the same time, the Catholic activists during that conference were more directed and envisaging homosexual context. We can find different genders. Gender is an analytical category.
Sondern in Kombination mit ethischen, rassischen, Klassen, Alters- und anderen Unterschieden.
So I will draw on results of my report from 2021 about the gender discourse in Ukraine and a recent research article about the implementation of the Istanbul Convention in Ukraine. The gender debate is one of the most controversial public issues in all Christian churches. Gender is frequently framed as a threat for one's identity, be it as Christians or as a certain nation or as family. Thus, the gender discourse appears to be closely connected to the question of social identity. On the other side, the gender itself is about identity. It describes how individual identity may be in conflict with binary prescriptions of sexuality. Thus, gender studies aim at justice for the individual in his or her single identity. I would even say that it is a core Christian concept, longing to embrace every single person in its individual identity.
Zeigt die Kritik an dieser Politik durch die Genderstudie. Gender mainstreaming
in the gender mainstream, we can see even criticism of the most well-known publications. There is a neoliberal view and dramatization of relations between sexes. And the notion of gender ideology. We are talking about femininity, about masculinity, and about sexual roles in private life, in social life. We are speaking about ascribing these gender roles to people and the asymmetry of these relations between two people and gender mainstream in the Catholic Church. I would speak here about three approaches. Catholic ideologies differentiate between a woman and a man.
Okay, danke.
Obviously, such a category is a threat for power structures. It is a threat for communalities, which are based on the repression and obedience of the individual. It therefore provokes critique and even hatred from conservative religious groups who built their community on patriarchal rules and hierarchies. Gender became a buzzword for all kinds of protest against individual freedom and rights. It is dismissed as ideology, although if you take academic writing on gender seriously, gender itself is a concept of ideology critique. It is open for discourse, critique, and the lived experience of people, all things missing in an ideology. At the end of the fourth conference for women in Beijing, the representatives of the Holy See introduced their own vision.
Nationen verstanden werden kann. Aber fügt zugleich seine eigene Interpretation bei.
We can look at how the United Nations understand this.
Gegründet auf die jeweilige biologische sexuelle Identität, die entweder männlich oder weiblich ist.
And the Holy See is basing it on the natural distinction between female and masculine identity.
Zwischen den beiden Geschlechtern in einem einzigen statischen Muster festgelegt versteht. Zwar wird die Frage nicht erklärt, wie die Unterschiede zwischen Männern und Frauen in einem Modell der Komplementarität von biologischem Determinismus und auch von der Hierarchie der Geschlechter.
What is the difference between a man and woman? It's the model of complementarity and hierarchy, and genders should be freed of those. How is this all connected to Ukraine? The gender discourse arrived in Ukraine with the debate of European integration. That means almost 30 years ago. As in other post-Soviet states, the first institutions engaging with gender questions have been financed and supported by Western universities and foundations. This is not because in the societies themselves the question of gender identity or sexual orientation did not exist, but out of a traumatic and hidden history with homosexuality as a means of repression in the Soviet Union, the political will to engage with these people and the marginalizing structures was lacking. Following the foreign support for LGBTIQ and feminist movements, as well as gender studies, served as a reason to blame these topics as foreign and not traditional for Ukraine. The Ukrainian churches got involved in the discourse about gender at least in 2011, when Ukraine was one of the first signatories of the Council of Europe Convention on preventing and combating violence against women and domestic violence, better known as Istanbul Convention. There has been a debate about LGBTIQ affirmative politics in the churches before. However, now the topic gained Ukrainian ownership. Ukraine participated in drafting the convention. The idea of Western gender colonialism somehow failed or was questioned with the efforts to implement the Istanbul Convention, but the churches and religious communities continued to frame gender as a foreign concept and threat for Ukrainian identity. But in contrast to the conservative movement in other European countries and churches, in Ukraine, the anti-European direction of this criticism appeared increasingly problematic. The pro-European discourse was and is a major element of Ukrainian churches in order to distance them from the Russian claim of interpreting the identity of Kiev Christianity. To be part of Europe is crucial for all Ukrainian churches, and they showed this commitment in an impressive way during the Euromaidan. From 2014 onwards, it was increasingly difficult to comply with the anti-genderist coalition led by Russia and the Russian Orthodox Church. It is therefore no surprise that the events of the Euromaidan also triggered a forced engagement of the churches with the gender topic as a way to give the pro-European agenda a certain shape. I call this being Europe without gender. We are speaking here not only about the notions, but also the criticism of gender identity is not compatible with the feminist campaign, with the third wave of feminist campaign, discreditation of gender. Discreditation of gender pertains to all the feminism. American sociologist Barbara Marshall in North America is speaking about two directions of anti-gender campaign, and one line of this criticism pertains to so-called libertarian gender for conservatives means casting aside the naturalistic differences between men and women. At the same time, libertarian approach is telling us that gender feminism is nothing but a Marxist ideology that has nothing to do with the distribution, with the division of human beings into male and female. So they put aside, they cast away the questions of gender analysis. According to Ms. Marshall, the conservative fundamentalist criticism finds itself within the essay of Opus Dei member O'Leary, Gender Deconstruction of Women, which has been very popular among the Women's Conference in Beijing, of which I mentioned. The leadership of the Catholic Church is accepting anti-feminist statements because it does not accept the equal rights of women, together with the United Nations Women's Organization. And non-holy or unholy alliance had been created between the Vatican and Islamic countries in order to substitute human rights with the notion of human dignity. The reason for that being that women and men have equal dignity, but do not have equal rights. For anti-gender discourse, it is important to mention two German authors, and we see them in the words of the German bishops. In some articles published in 2006, it is mentioned that gender mainstreaming is political gender reassignment. The reason for that being, the aim for that being, creation of a new human being through the destruction of the traditional roles of two sexes. In the positions of some of the bishops' conferences and some particular bishops, we can come across the following statements. Behind such noble concepts as gender equality, we see the culture of death or the desire to impose a sodomitic ideology. Another statement, gender ideology aims to gradually enforce the right to euthanasia or eugenics, that is, to fight for the elimination of sick, weak, disabled persons. Gender ideology is typical for National Socialism and communism. Are we talking here about lack of knowledge? Hardly so. I have compiled a lot of tables, and they show that anti-gender authors find the interpretation of gender in many documents, but they just ignore them. I would like to dwell on two examples. In 1998, the European Commission published a glossary where certain words pertaining to gender policy were defined in order to standardize them and use them all over the European Union in the same way. According to this glossary, gender means taking into account the gender differences between women and men in a particular policy area or certain field of activity. In 8 years, in 2006, Gabrielle Kubi, in her book, The Gender Revolution, Relativism in Action, described gender as the worldview of gender missionaries who persecute those men who are trying to subjugate women. In 2004, German Commission Justitia et Pax stated gender mainstreaming consists of reorganizing, improving, developing, and evaluating decision-making processes. And they emphasized on the biblical and theological basis of this policy. Gender is a conception that emerged from the tendencies of standoff between men and women. This anthropology, which sought to promote perspectives for women's equality and to free them from any biological determinism, in fact inspires ideologies that promote, for example, the questioning of the family, which naturally includes parents, that is, father and mother, the equalization of homosexuality with heterosexuality, and a new model of homomorphous sexuality. So this is a kind of fight in the long run for the right of polygamy. The proponents of the anti-gender movement deliberately and consciously interpret very broadly further additions and definitions. Gender and gender mainstreaming act as empty baskets, so to speak, which can be filled with different accusations at will. Speaking about homosexuality and euthanasia, from such a broad spectrum, one can then select at will any topic that may just be useful at the national level, politically or socially. Given the lack of time, I will dwell only on some of the biased interpretations. For instance, at this statement that gender theory advocates the radical separation of sex and gender and denies biological corporeality. And it also because biological interconnections between sexes can be interpreted in different ways, and they are reflected in culture in different ways. the difference between sex and gender enables the deconstruction of gender stereotypes, as many bishops were interpreting this and many popes before. The deconstruction of gender stereotypes does not destroy Christian anthropology, but rather a particular anthropology based on Aristotle's natural law doctrine.
Auf Grundlage dieser Theorie haben die Scholastiker die Natur der Frau als passiv und vom Mann abhängig definiert.
We are speaking here about the ability of impregnation of a human being, and we are talking about the passiveness of the female, of the femininum, and the activity of the masculinum. Women are perceived as passive and dependent on men, and the role of men should be active. But this theory is currently not in accord with all the positions in the Bible, because in the Bible we will never find which role should a woman play and what role should a man play according to their nature. Thus, we are talking here not about the deconstruction or destruction of Christian ideology, but rather freeing from a philosophical theory that has been dominating for 2000 years. And this opens a possibility for ideology that is based on a biblical expression of the image of God and standing for an egalitarian gender model between sexes.
Spielen aber für die gegenwärtigen geschichtlich entwickelten kirchlichen Strukturen.
Why does the Catholic Church insist on erroneous thesis on gender ideology? Heteronormativity and gender stereotypes play an important role in current church structures. John Paul II said that the church is composed of an apostolic, patrine, and a Marian part. Gender do not necessarily coincide with biological presuppositions.
Beruft sich Johannes Paul II. Auf das Bild der Kirche als Braut Christi. Da Christus, der Bräutigam der Kirche,
John Paul II said in this respect, the apostolic patrine, that exclusion of women from the church life, from the ecclesiological life is hardly acceptable. John Paul II calls two dimensions of the church as male and female, an apostolic patrine dimension and Marian part, which is a female dimension. And here we have to listen to what others say. In this way, he naturalizes ecclesiastical structures. Ecclesiastical structures may change, at least within the Catholic Church and also among the bishops. These issues are being discussed. The criteria of further development of church structures should serve a just approach to all church members, regardless of their gender, race, representation of different social layers and classes. And the use of gender perspective may be of great help here.
Thank you, Dr. Anić, for your brilliant presentation and for giving us overview of the Catholic perception of this term and the idea, and also the criticism of that. It's actually exactly what we'll be talking today. That's our session panel is dedicated to the question of identity. So we are exploring issues of family values, gender, reproduction from the perspective of religious, political, and ideological identities. So thanks so much for doing that for us. And I know that you have to leave earlier. So if somebody has one question, and I would invite to ask this question, and then we'll turn to our next speaker. Do you have any questions in the chat as well? No questions. Okay, Doctor.
Okay.
Good, great. Thanks so much again for coming here and sharing with us your expertise on the subject. And now I am pleased and happy to introduce you our next speaker, Dr. Kristina Stoeckl, Professor of Sociology at the University of Innsbruck. And Dr. Stoeckl will talk on the conservative Aggiornamento of the Russian Orthodox Church and its role in the global culture wars. Dr. Stoeckl, the floor is yours.
Okay, so good morning. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you very much for having me. I would like to share a slide, and I think I can do that. So can you just confirm that you can see that? Yes. Okay, good. Now, okay, I think it works. Sorry. Okay, good. So I want to speak about, I want to introduce a topic that, a term that could be taken as a provocation, and maybe we can have a debate on that, the term a conservative aggiornamento. And I will be speaking about the Russian Orthodox Church and how the Moscow Patriarchate in the last 2 decades has become an actor in the global culture wars over family values, gender questions, questions of abortion, and so on. My presentation and what I'm going to speak about is based on a book project, which is due to be published already now in December. It will come out in December. The Moralist International, Russia and the Global Culture Wars. This is a research monograph I co-authored with my Russian colleague Dimitrius Lanar. And it is based on a 5-year-long research on the connections between Russian Orthodox actors, mostly actors of the Moscow Patriarchate, but also Russian Orthodox civil society, and their connections with Christian right groups in the West, especially in North America. The book is structured in 2 parts, and one is called Learning the Culture Wars, and the other one Doing the Culture Wars. In the first part, Learning the Culture Wars, that's the one I will be speaking about today. We ask what has to happen to a religious tradition, to religious actors, to a church, in order to speak the language of the global culture wars. I will not be speaking today about the second part, the Doing the Culture Wars, namely how the Russian Orthodox Church has then acted upon its self-assigned role as a defender of traditional values. But just to say 2 words about that second part, this is what we've seen and what we've witnessed, all of us, over the last years, the Russian Orthodox Church trying to play itself into the foreground as a defender of family values, traditional values, as a networker with Christian right groups in the West, actively making contacts also with conservative parts in the Catholic Church. The term Holy Alliance that we heard about in the previous presentation was also used in order to describe contacts between Moscow Patriarchate and the Vatican. So I think the doing the culture wars part is something we as observers of the phenomenon are probably already acquainted with. It's the learning the culture wars part, which I think is still poorly understood. And it is this part which Dimitrios, Lana, and I have tried to catch with the phrase, a conservative aggiornamento. Now, the term aggiornamento is a positive term in the Catholic tradition. It was used by Pope John XXIII in 1959 during his announcement of the Second Vatican Council. And it signified the future council's desire to make Catholicism catch up with the spirit of the time. The analysis in the book shows that there is also a second option, an aggiornamento in the direction of conservatism. The second option is often dismissed in the literature as fundamentalism. But the concept of fundamentalism functions like blinders. It prevents us from seeing something. It dismisses religious conservative positions as merely reactive, anti-modernist, obscurantist, as a resistance to the progressive march of liberal modernity. And if you want to use that image of a march, so the idea is that progressive theology marches forward, whereas fundamentalists just stand still or march backward. And this we say is a kind of a blinding concept sociologically, because it prevents us from seeing that in order to speak as a conservative actor in the global culture wars, there's actually a lot of change necessary, a lot of learning, and the process inside the Russian Orthodox Church is a good example for that. So this is what we mean with conservative aggiornamento. So there is a learning process behind becoming a player in the global culture wars. Russian Orthodox conservatism traditionally is anti-Western, anti-modern, and anti-Latin, anti-Catholic. It is not immediately clear, and it's not immediately easy that the Moscow Patriarchate will find its allies today among Western Christian right, evangelical, Protestant, and Catholic, and that it will include on its traditionalist agenda a whole list of issues which until 20 years ago, or even more recently, until 10, 15 years ago, were not at all on the agenda. The most clear example is abortion. You all know that abortion was a widespread practice in the Soviet Union, and it was not something that the Orthodox Church addressed. It could have addressed it, but it did not, because it didn't recognize it as its central topic. More striking topics is, for example, homeschooling for religious reasons, or the fight against same-sex marriage, in the complete absence of a movement that asks for same-sex marriage in Russia itself at the moment, for the reasons you know, that this is forbidden. So the Russian Orthodox Church acquired new topics in the process of learning about the dynamics of global ideological divisions that we sum up as the culture wars. This learning process has had several effects on the Russian Orthodox Church, on the other Orthodox churches and the Orthodox Church in general, and on the world, unfortunately. first of all, what does it mean for the Russian Orthodox Church? Defining Russian Orthodoxy as uniquely geared towards defending traditional values, defined in terms of moral conservatism derived from a global culture war agenda, silences other ways of understanding the role of orthodoxy in society. It silences liberal voices, but also other voices that just don't think that social ethics and these moral questions are the most pressing. These alternatives are silenced and forgotten. And in the Russian context, we've seen that the church has completely allied with the state, becoming a provider of ideology for a state policy, which uses this agenda of traditional values for political means in order to be repressive to the inside vis-a-vis its own society, and to expand to the outside as an illiberal, anti-Western actor in international politics. What does it mean for the other Orthodox churches? I think the rise of the Moscow Patriarchate, the self-proclaimed rise of the Moscow Patriarchate, one should say, as a defender of traditional values, has polarized also inside the Orthodox churches. Let's be clear, for the most part, the Orthodox churches agree on questions regarding family values, gender questions. There are very few Orthodox theologians who would open up to questions of same-sex marriage or abortion, but not all of, for the Orthodox churches, a great polarization to the inside. But what does it mean, as I said, for the world? And especially what has it meant in the situation of Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine? We've seen that the attack on Ukraine has been justified by the Patriarch in culture war terms, saying that Ukraine is being brought up against its Orthodox heritage and Russian tradition by the West, and the West is influencing and organizing gay parades and advocating gender issues. It was a puzzle to see the language of the culture wars being employed in order to justify a real war. So the culture wars, which we think about as wars over ideas, values, but on the whole, wars that are fought through the means of petitions, resolutions, mobilization, to make this language the basis for a real military attack. That was, what will the consequences of that be? I think, first of all, what we see is that this Russian role as a leader in the global culture wars is definitely harmed by Russia's decision to turn this into a real war. Many conservative Christians in the West who have looked to Russia as an example of defender of traditional values have paused, have stopped. I think very few would really say that the values they stand for have to be defended militarily. So in that sense, Russia's symbolic capital, the Russian Orthodox Church symbolic capital, has been harmed by this war. But for us who are doing, as people doing research on the culture wars, this is not good news, because the culture wars won't go away. The division inside modern societies over pressing morality policy issues will not go away. The mobilization around these issues will equally stay salient. And even if now the Russian Orthodox Church aspiring role to leadership on the conservative side is in a way paused or has come to a halt, there will be other actors and new actors who take over and carry forward a global ideological division and debate. I want to say a last thing. After this whole research project on Russia trying to become a leader in the global culture wars as a defender of traditional values, I've come to the idea that this conservative Aggiornamento was very much political from the beginning. There has been, since the fall of the Soviet Union, there has been the desire inside Russia to develop a new political agenda that is global. So Russia stood for communism, it stood for the other to the European, to the Western, liberal democratic societies. And that, what does Russia stand for now? This was a big question in the 90s, in the 2000s. It could no longer stand for the alternative economic program, because Russia by that time was also fully in a capitalist system integrated. So Russia decided for itself to stand for the other, the other program to liberal democracy. And interestingly, and that's the point we meant with the Aggiornamento and the learning part. This alternative agenda that Russia now claims to represent, to be the other to Western liberal democracy. This alternative program is itself very much a product of Western liberal democratic societies that are internally divided on these issues. So Russian actors very skillfully picked up a divide that is part and parcel of our story. And they turned that into a global ideological tool, minus all the checks and balances and a certain culture also of finding compromises that characterizes Western societies and that have enabled Western societies up until today to deal with difficult morality policy issues. So what is at stake with this role of Russia as a global polarizer on moral values is not only the role of Russia, it's not only the terrible situation we are facing now with Ukraine having been declared by Russia as a battleground for these questions. What is at stake is our very societies as well, and our ways of dealing with difficult morality policy issues. What is at stake is in a way a culture of compromise and debate that has carried us over many of these difficult debates and that we now see collapsing. Just think about the situation in the US now over abortion, for example, where questions are being reopened that we thought had been in a way solved. So I really think this is something that concerns all of us as we are sitting in very different countries in different ways. And that's why I'm very glad that you organized that panel. And I will stop here and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Stoeckl, for your presentation. And I do look forward to reading your book, which sounds fascinating and brilliant. And honestly, over the last years, traveling abroad and talking to different theologians or religious studies scholars, I was puzzled that so much that people in the West would have this kind of admiration for the Russian Orthodox Church and wouldn't see this church as an instrument for the state politics. And I don't know, to me, it's looked like to be blind in a way. And I think that's what you're talking about. They use their tricks to make it possible that the West with the democracy ideas became in a way blind towards what was the reality out there. So thanks so much for bringing this out and sharing with us your research. Do you have any questions from the audience, because Dr. Stoeckl also has to leave the panel sooner? Are there any questions, Roman?
Я маю запитання, якщо
Okay.
можна.
I have a question, if I may.
Російська православна церква дуже часто використовувала
The Russian
ці
Orthodox
різні наративи,
Church
скажімо, щодо екуменізму,
often utilized
протягом
various
Радянського Союзу.
narratives about
Російська православна церква була за
communism.
екуменізм,
In times of the
за
Soviet
мир
time,
проти
the Russian
війни,
Orthodox
але це
Church
все
was for
виставлялося як зовнішня
communism,
оболонка
against communism
проти
and for
Заходу.
peace
Всередині ж
globally. It
Радянського
was just
Союзу
used as a
Російська православна
facade
церква
for the
була
West. Within the
проти
Soviet
миру
Union,
і проти
the
економічного
Russian
руху,
Orthodox
так би інші
Church was
деномінації були
against
просто
peace,
подавлені.
and all the other
Наскільки
religious
серйозно ми
denominations
можемо
were
сприймати
suppressed.
як партнера в діалозі Російського
How
православної церкви, так
seriously
і
should
ілюмінувати
we
їхні,
view
скажімо,
the Russian Orthodox Church as a
стейтменти,
partner
їхні
in religious
пропозиції,
dialogue?
якщо
Should
вони,
we
скажімо,
analyze their
пропонують
statements,
щось одне
their
назовні, але
proposals,
насправді
because
воно не
they
стосується
articulate
серйозної
one thing
внутрішньої
for the
дискусії, так,
outside,
як нам бути в
but there are
цьому
a lot
питанні,
of
як нам будувати діалог, і
inner
чи варто
discussions
будувати
that we are
діалог,
not really
якщо
aware
партнер не
of.
готовий до
Should
нього.
we forge this dialogue with them, especially if this partner is not ready and is not transparent and open with us? Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you for that question. I think it's a very valid question. I think especially in the light of recent events, it's become clear that the West, and especially Western churches, have had an erroneous, almost exclusive focus on the Moscow Patriarchate and on things that came out of the Moscow Patriarchate. I mean, just think about how many essays and meetings have been organized on the social doctrine of the Russian Orthodox Church, on other doctrines of the Russian Orthodox Church. I mean, I'm myself guilty of that, you know, having studied very much the documentation that came out of the Moscow Patriarchate. I have to say, though, that I did that in a way in good faith. I thought that we are actually observing a process of theological, you know, reform, slow, very slow, conservative, yes, but little steps moving forward. We see now that under the current leadership, so under Patriarch Kirill, these steps were either not sincere, they were either never meant to lead anywhere, they were just window dressing, or they were sincere, but they have now been stopped. And the agenda that now rules is the anti-ecumenical, extremely nationalist Ruski Mir agenda. So at this point, I really think we have to reckon with a complete breakdown of communication, because the assumptions we had for dialogue have turned out to be wrong. So in that sense, I think what this means for Western churches, but I'm not, you know, I'm not a theologian, I'm a sociologist. But also I think in sociology of religion and in the study of the Orthodox Church by political scientists or historians, the Russian Orthodox Church and the Moscow Patriarchate were always kind of central, you know, because they're hierarchical, they were central. And this institutional unity and centrality is gone. There are now other institutional entities in the Russian Orthodox tradition, you know, that includes the Ukrainian Orthodox Church that has now declared itself independent, but it also includes the Orthodox Church of Ukraine that has been recognized now by the Ecumenical Patriarchate, but is still, you know, comes out of that same tradition. So at least we have now multiple articulations of sort of Eastern Slavic Orthodox tradition. And for us sociologists, that means that we have to change the way we work and we look at the field. It's become multiple. We have to learn new languages, Ukrainian first of all, also create new networks. So this is a challenge. And that's one of the reasons why I was very happy to be invited to your panel, because I think this is a place where to start. So whoever now says, okay, I'm studying Russian Orthodoxy or you know, Eastern Slavic Orthodoxy, you know, the field is completely opened. And that's a good thing, first, I would say. But I wish we wouldn't have had to learn the lesson that way.
Thank you, Dr. Stoeckl. And now I would like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Thomas Mark Nemeth, Professor of Theology of the Christian East from the Catholic Theological Faculty of Vienna University. And Dr. Nemeth will talk about what is relevant to our Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. And his talk is on the issue of ideological elements in the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church's identity. Dr. Nemeth, the floor is yours.
Добрий день, слава Ісусу Христу. Дорогі слухачі, сердечно вітаю вас. Також
Glory to Jesus Christ, dear listeners, dear audience. I'm glad to welcome you to this welcome. Also on behalf of the Theological Department of the Vienna University, that is also part of this forum. And I will be speaking not in English, but in Ukrainian, because this is the question that pertains to the inner processes within my church. And I would like my listeners, who are, first of all, Ukrainians, understand me better. I am grateful to the organizers for an ability to speak in this issue. My scholarly topics are church history, understanding the development of tradition and canonical aspects, but I'm above all interested in the identity as a priest in pastoral life and as a scholar in the research and investigation of tradition. The word identity may be often heard in the discussions within the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, especially when it comes to understanding of the role of tradition of Eastern and Western churches. Apart from the sphere of liturgical discussion, in other spheres of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, there is almost always only one thought. While in the Roman Catholic environment in the West, there is a lot of a variety of discussions between the so-called reformators and conservatives. By identity, I mean the consciousness of the members of the community in which their uniqueness is manifested. Identity is also a social phenomenon, therefore it interacts with the environment and changes over time. The word ideology usually has a negative connotation, but it can also be a neutral term that reflects a worldview, certain values, or norms. Here we are talking about the principles that form the concept of we, often not verified. By the way, I often hear the word our church, our people, our tradition, etc. Since the 19th century, there is a concept of ideology that emphasizes the fact that these ideas are not based on evidence or arguments, but are aimed at stabilizing or changing power relations. Ideological statements are also statements that cannot be verified, but are elevated to generally accepted facts. There is also the opinion that religion and Christianity are actually a kind of ideology. This is, of course, an external approach, which probably does not correspond to the self-esteem of most Christians. But is there an ideology-free zone to which you can retreat as a Christian? Christianity also has a critical approach to ideology, as the experience of the 20th century shows. Resistance against the ideology of totalitarian regimes. But there are also examples of cooperation of religions as organizations with world powers. Czech theologian Tomáš Halík recently noted that Christianity is changing and needs changes. On the threshold of modernity, Christianity disintegrated as a cultural and political empire. It was replaced by the form of Christianity as a confession, as a worldview. This form disappeared in the cultural pluralism of postmodernity. Today, two new forms of Christianity are emerging, quote, quote, non-church spirituality and political use of Christianity as the identification and political ideology of the extreme right, end of quote. Now, regarding the issue of gender in the discourse of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. In his wartime sermons, Moscow Patriarch Kirill repeatedly called for confrontation with the West and linked the war in Ukraine with a metaphysical struggle with gay parades. But also in the churches of Ukraine, there is a rejection of certain ideas about gender. which, as I see, are not well researched from the point of view of a scientific basis. Certain slogans are being used here, which gives me the impression of anti-gender ideology. The All-Ukrainian Council of Churches and Religious Organizations published about 25 texts on the topic of the family and against gender ideology as a gender to society. This is a very large number of documents compared to other topics. In an interview after his inauguration in 2011, His Beatitude Sviatoslav positively emphasized that the Catholic charity organization Church in Need, or Kirche in Not, proposed a strategic alliance between the Catholic Church and the Russian Orthodox Church for family values at a conference with Metropolitan Hilarion Alfeev, and that he felt, quote, very comfortable, end of quote, itself part of such an alliance. In 2014, already after the annexation of Crimea, Gabriel Kubi, a popular publicist and right-wing Catholic circles, took part in a conference on family values in Moscow and made ambiguous statements about the annexation of Crimea. In 2016, the Synod of the Kiev-Halitsky Supreme Archdiocese of the UGCC invited Kubi, noted her in the decisions, and apparently, with her help, prepared this measure regarding the danger of gender ideology. The document of the Synod writes, for example, quote, gender ideology insists that a person can freely choose and embody their sexual identity regardless of their biological sex, end of quote. The interpretation of gender ideology is too simplistic and tendentious. The wording gender ideology itself is a certain construct. It is not clear where to get the statement about the definition of the various definitions. As I see it, unlike biological sex, gender refers to social manifestation of sex. Gender is a social, cultural, religious, economic factors that affect specific social ideas about sex, about masculine and about feminine. The word gender in church documents is often used as a term for collecting negative phenomena, but no references are given where it comes from, and therefore it is impossible to check whether it is really so. This is not specific to the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church or even Ukraine on the whole, but it is found in various church documents of different countries. There is also a document dated by 2021, address of the Synod of Bishops of the Kiev-Halitsky Supreme Archdiocese of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church on the prevention of domestic violence and the establishment of traditional family values in Ukraine. Now I will give a longer quotation from that document. Domestic violence today becomes an argument of those who create various new ideologies to fight and destroy the institution of the family as the primary cell of society, emphasizing the false ideas about the inequality of men and women in so-called patriarchal cultures. Traditional family values are highlighted as dangerous for the life and health of modern people, and the family is ridiculed as the root cause of any violence, considering it not an environment of love, but primarily a place of inciting hatred and inflicting physical and psychological wounds. End of quote. The problem here lies in the fact that domestic violence is not interpreted as a wider social problem, as underlined by the Istanbul Convention, and as a problem that can be understood precisely with the help of gender research tools. That is why it is not enough for the Church to show empathy and appeal to morality, but it is necessary to involve social tools and study them so as not to see them as evil a priori. I also see that sites like rodina.org.ua have taken a one-sided position and take on a mainly apologetic role, instead of being platforms where you can discuss and freely express your opinion. It is also important for this not to immediately see your interlocutor as an enemy who wants evil for society. Next topic, man and woman. Another important point of discussion is the equality of men and women. Pope John XXIII, for example, understood the social equality of women as a sign of the times. Canon 11 of the Catholic canon law writes, among all the faithful, by virtue of their regeneration in Christ, there is true equality of dignity and action, as a result of which everyone, according to their position and task, cooperates in building up the body of Christ. End of quote. This means to me that any inequality between men and women must have a justification. In the context of the sacrament of marriage, questions arise about how the UGCC treats the issue of equality between men and women. Their hourly books have, under Western influence, marriage vows in which the bride promises obedience to the groom, but the groom does not. This element is partially absent in practice in the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church diaspora, as one bishop told me. The Catechism of the UGCC speaks only of a mutual promise of love, loyalty, and respect. However, with reference to Ephesians, Epistle to Ephesians, chapter 5, verses 20-24, which is always read in the Byzantine marriage, right? The man is called the head of the woman. This text was written in the context of other social realities, and it is not clear what it should mean today. The blessing of women after the wedding ceremony with the wearing of headscarf is also extremely anachronistic. Although there is no cultic impurity in the UGCC as there is in the Orthodox, there are also problematic texts in the rites related to the birth of a child. There is also inequality in the introduction of girls into the sanctuary at baptism, despite the long-standing traditions that treat children equally. In general, biblical hermeneutics is often absent from church texts and explanations. Church documents and liturgical practice clearly lag behind exegetical thinking today. Also, the Catechism of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church does not specify what the claimed biblical equality and difference between men and women consists of. This issue, which needs to be understood, is unfortunately not yet investigated in the UGCC. Another point, and the last one, tasks for theology. Unfortunately, I notice a certain skepticism and distance from the church hierarchy regarding academic theology. During my 3 years as a professor in Vienna, I had enough academic inquiries, but certainly not from representatives of my church. Theology in Ukraine is often understood in its apologetic and defensive role and not in its critical function. I therefore gratefully refer to the statement of the former Archbishop of Vienna, Cardinal Franz Koenig, about theology as a dangerous science. Quote, "It would be absolutely wrong not to take a step into new territory because there is a risk of error, but one should always remain aware of the relativity of scientific knowledge and perspectives, especially in theology." And then he continues, "A theologian may err. Error is the risk of freedom. Theology is not a warm room for a weary mind. Theology is a dangerous science. To devote oneself to it requires the courage of free men, a courage that is matched by humility, not with arrogance." End of quote. Cardinal Koenig understood that loyalty and criticality of the Church are not mutually exclusive and that theology as a science exists not only for the Church. This also applies to Eastern theology, which has an apophatic dimension and the experience that the mystery of God cannot be clearly defined in human terms. And one must see the space where God himself acts without our description. The advantage of the theology of the Eastern Catholic churches is that it has access to Catholic doctrine and to the theological approaches of the East and Asian Church, which provides protection from extreme positions and allows the development of thought. Theology is important for critical reflection within the churches because one of the main temptations in the church, as we can see, is relation with power and authority. Among the forms of subjugation by the authorities is also interference into the sexual sphere, for example, in confession. And these topics are often tabooed, and there is a lack of practical words and terms for this area. At the end, I will say that there are certain social circumstances that formed early Christianity and vice versa. As Franz Dünzel, professor of ancient church history in Würzburg, wrote, quote, "It seems to me that a strong point of Christian religion that it can without any panic face enlightenment and even historical criticism." He says further on, our image of history from that point of view is already a construct, but even more so, every historical representation is based on selection. And this is a real adventure of spirit. And to this spirit, history serves to change a human being in its relation, in their relation to the world and to him or herself. Are we aware of this, that our identity is also a construct? In the church, it is important to have a praying, mystical life, not just analytical, but also analytical and critical thinking. Within the UGCC, there is a potential for critical analysis, and it pertains also to others, to the Roman Orthodox Church, to the Roman Pope, and the critical evaluation of the management of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. It also should be there because it's easier to look at everything from the historical perspective, for instance, from the perspective of the Union of Brest. Also, I would like to say a couple of words about the situation in Ukraine. Today's current situation in the society can be understood as locus theologicus. Many traces of sanctity we can see beyond church borders, and these values, although we are fighting for values in Ukraine, these are the values of human dignity. It would be nice to see how Ukrainian Christianity found a new language. This requires maturity, and the churches have to pay attention how to foster new people for maturity. And here are the doors open for our discussion. Thank you for our critical analysis of our church. When I was listening to you, I had an impression like you were articulating my thoughts in this academic discourse. Because we need to talk and discuss. We don't need just to polarize ideas and sit in different camps without any common platform for dialogue. I agree with you, especially in the context when we as a Greek Catholic Church declare to be global. And when I talk to UGCC representatives in Canada and America, I can say that they perceive these issues emotionally, and how our church reacts and why does it react this or another way. So it's high time to speak about this. There is still the question of female ritual inchastity. It's still there and it has not been solved. Also, shall a boy and a girl be introduced into the sanctuarium it's also a question of marking identity and roles. So this is also an invitation to discuss.
And now I'll switch to English again. And I'm happy to introduce right now Dr. Regina Elsner, the research fellow in the social ethics of Orthodox Christianity at the Center for Eastern European and International Studies in Berlin. And Dr. Elsner will talk on how the question of gender impacts Ukrainian churches' search for identity. Regina, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me, and also for inviting me for this topic, because of course it is an honor and a challenge to talk to a Ukrainian audience about Ukrainian churches. So I will be very happy about your feedback also. And I'm very happy, and I also congratulate you for this great conference in these challenging times. I think this is really an inspiration for us to go on with our work. With my talk, I will draw, a lot of things have already been said. I will draw on two texts I published not so long ago, and I will put them also in the chat so you can have a look onwards. I wrote a report at Zeus about the gender discourse in Ukraine and how it challenges the churches in Ukraine. And most recently, there was published an article about the implementation of the Istanbul Convention in Ukraine. So I will put this later in the chat, and you may disseminate this. So the gender debate is, as we already had heard, one of the most controversial public issues in all Christian churches, in fact. Gender is frequently framed as a threat for one's identity, be it as a Christian or as a certain nation or as a family. And thus the gender discourse appears to be closely connected, of course, to the question of identity, of social identity. It is natural to put these both topics together. On the one side, on the other side, gender itself is about identity. It describes how individual identity may be in conflict with binary prescriptions of sexuality. And thus gender studies aim at justice for the individual, for his or her single identity. I would even say that gender could be described as a core Christian concept because it longs to embrace every single person in its individual identity. But obviously, such a category is a threat for power structures. It is a threat for communalities which are based on the repression and on obedience of the individual. And it therefore naturally provokes critique and even hatred from conservative religious groups who build their community on patriarchal rules and hierarchies. Gender became a buzzword, I would say, for all kinds of protest against individual freedom and rights. And we see this also in Germany with our protest demonstrations, where gender is always the threat word for everything bad in the world, you could say. It is dismissed as an ideology, although if you take academic writing on gender seriously, gender itself is a concept of ideology critique. It is open for discourse, it is open for critique, and it is open for the lived experience of people, all things missing in an ideology, in fact. So how is this discourse about gender, about we have heard so much already, how is this connected to Ukraine? The gender discourse arrived in Ukraine with the debate of European integration. That means almost 30 years ago. As in other post-Soviet states, the first institutions engaging with gender questions have been financed and supported by Western universities and foundations. This is not because in the societies themselves, the question of gender identity or sexual orientation did not exist, but out of a traumatic and hidden history with homosexuality. I think, in fact, that this Soviet history of using homosexuality as a means of repression is really crucial in understanding what is going on in Eastern Europe with this gender discourse. So out of this traumatic and hidden history of homosexuality as a means of repression in the Soviet Union, the political will to engage with these people and with the marginalizing structures was just lacking in Ukraine and also in other post-Soviet countries. Following the foreign support for LGBTIQ and feminist movements, so the financing from abroad, as well as the support for gender studies, served as a reason to blame these topics as foreign or not traditional for Ukraine. So there has not been an engagement from Ukrainian society with these topics, and that's why foreign finances, foundations try to support this discourse and topics and the people behind it. And this is one reason why you see this labeling of this is foreign, this is alien, this is not Ukrainian. Ukrainian churches got involved in this discourse about gender at least in 2011, when Ukraine was one of the first signatories of the Council of Europe Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, better known as the Istanbul Convention. There has been a debate about LGBTIQ affirmative politics in the churches before this date. However, now the topic gained Ukrainian ownership because Ukraine participated in drafting this document, the convention. So this is not anymore about something foreign or alien. We have to talk about it as a Ukrainian issue. The idea of Western gender colonialism, how it is called, somehow failed or was questioned at least with the efforts to implement the Istanbul Convention in Ukraine. But the churches and the religious communities continued to frame gender as a foreign concept and a threat for Ukrainian identity. But in contrast to conservative movements in other European countries, so as we heard about Catholic churches or also other Orthodox churches in Western countries, in contrast to this conservative movement, in Ukraine, the anti-European direction of this criticism appeared increasingly problematic. So in Western Europe, we have the critique of the Istanbul Convention connected with an anti-European sentiment. So Europe as a colonial system. In Ukraine, this is not so easily possible to take this as an anti-European direction. The pro-European discourse was and is a major element of Ukrainian churches in order to distance them from the Russian claim of interpreting the identity of Kievan Christianity. So to be part of Europe is crucial for all Ukrainian churches. And they showed this commitment in an impressive way during the Euromaidan. From 2014 onwards, it was increasingly difficult to comply with the anti-genderist coalition led by Russia and by the Russian Orthodox Church. It is therefore no surprise that the events of the Euromaidan also triggered a forced engagement of the churches with the gender topic as a way to give the pro-European agenda a certain shape. So I call this in my article also being Europe without gender. So you want to be Europe, but please without gender. But how does this work? It works by trying, in fact, to deconstruct the discourse in several pieces. The debate about the Istanbul Convention was split into, on the one side, a commitment to the fight against violence, and on the other hand, the rejection of the gender ideology. The churches jointly developed what they call a sovereign strategy against domestic violence. So this is this talk about we need to have a domestic laws that tackle violence, but without the gender ideology. And this strategy would simultaneously take certain Ukrainian traditions about the natural family, and it would also simultaneously detach Ukraine from the Russian discourse, because the Russian discourse is in Ukraine pictured as patriarchal, as violent, and Ukraine don't want to be like this Russian patriarchal and violent discourse. On the other hand, the churches continued to fight the implementation of gender in Ukrainian law as an alien concept, opening the doors for a new Marxist ideology with the aim to change anthropological cornerstones. And for this purpose, they employ Western anti-gender actors like Gabriele Kubi or Church in Need, we just heard about them already, in order to connect the Ukrainian case with the European anti-gender coalition. In this context, Ukraine and the Ukrainian churches see themselves on a European mission. Ukrainian churches feel a special mission to save the true Christian Europe from ideological threats like gender ideology, which seem to be transported by the EU structures in opposition to traditional European ideals. So Ukrainian churches frame these European values in a traditional way in order to fight genderism. From this perspective, to be European and to fight the concept of gender is no contradiction, but is rather a logical consequence of this European self-consciousness of Ukraine's churches. It is exactly this European commitment that detaches Ukrainian religious discourse from Russian discourse, although the arguments seem to be similar. However, these discourses are shaped rather by cultural and populist arguments than theological. And here I also agree with what Thomas Nemeth just said. There is still a lack of serious theological engagement with gender beyond simply dismissing it as an ideology. In the search of Ukrainian identity, to detach Ukrainian churches from both the Russian claim and the European liberalism, that means to outline a negative identity. So we are not like them, and not like them. This became a more important point than the question what the churches in Ukraine have to offer as a positive identity. What I mean here is first the legacy of the Maidan and the church's effort to frame human dignity on a socio-ethical level. If the churches would continue to follow this trace of theological engaging with human dignity and a dignified society, that would ultimately come to an understanding of gender as a concept of justice, as it is developed by academical gender studies. We can see this path, for example, when looking at the efforts to overcome domestic violence. If you take these efforts in Ukraine seriously, you won't stop at dismissing physical violence, as Thomas Nemeth also described, but you have to engage with different ways of violence and with structures of inequality which lead to violence. This is doing gender. The second factor, which could lead to a more positive identity, is the ambition of the Ukrainian churches to be in close connection with the people, to foster pastoral care and social and individual crisis. This is also one legacy, or I see it as one legacy of the Maidan and of the Russian war, to be with the people and not to be some hierarchy somewhere up in the clouds. And if you take this effort seriously, you will have to listen to the lived experience of your faithful, among which are people with non-heteronormative gender identity and sexual orientation. There's a wonderful project come from the workshop of religious studies in Kiev called Combining the Incompatible. The investigators of this project interviewed LGBTIQ believers, and I really recommend you to read their stories, to engage with their lived religiosity and their experience of suffering within their own churches. On a theological level, reflecting about this means more than assuming just their sinfulness. To look for justice for these believers is part of doing gender. As a conclusion, Ukrainian churches have been in search of their identity for about 30 years. The Euromaidan and the Russian war have divergent impact on this search. While the Russian war pushes to frame identity against the other, othering the other side, the Euromaidan pushes to frame identity as a positive self-consciousness. We are European. The concept of gender contests both processes, as it demands from churches to engage theologically with the other, and not only on a cultural or political level. Gender is a category of justice, and as this category of justice, it is in fundamental opposition to an exclusivist or static identity. So I also agree with Thomas Nemeth and with you, Halyna, that the task for Ukrainian churches on this search for identity is to engage theologically, seriously and theologically, with what gender is really about. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Regina, for your fantastic and brilliant overview of our liminality, let me put it this way, and also for giving us hope that we can discuss the things, and there is an open space to do that. Thanks so much for doing that for us. And I'll switch right now to Ukrainian. Дуже дякую усім учасникам і учасницям.
I'm very grateful to all the participants of our panel discussion. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, so we don't really have any time for questions and answers. But I'm sincerely grateful to all those who found the time to participate. I'm particularly grateful to our speakers and panelists for having shared their viewpoints, for having offered their assessment of the situation, and having instilled hope that we can still do something in the future. We will definitely not stop. We need to continue the hard work. The Euromaidan and the ongoing war allow us to flex our muscles and to build a completely different society, an open society that will frankly express what it thinks. Unfortunately, we cannot really watch the video recording by Dr. Massimo Faggioli, but that video recording will be available on the YouTube channel of the Ecumenical Studies Institute of the Ukrainian Catholic University. You can see the link in the chat. And to wrap up, I would like to express my gratitude to our partner, the Vienna University. Thank you for having contributed to the organization of this panel discussion. Once again, a big thank you to everyone. Enjoy the rest of the day. And by the way, I would like to remind everyone that you can use the same Zoom link to join the next session that will start at 1:30 p.m. And we are going to talk about the following topic: churches, nations, political identities, and we will also be talking about identity as well. Glory be to